The wind died on the shores of Aulis, and 1,000 ships began to rot. For weeks, the Aegean Sea was as hard and smooth as a polished bronze shield. The sails of the greatest armada in human memory hung like dead skin from the towering pine masts. On the beaches, 100,000 men baked inside their heavy armor. They had gathered from every mountain kingdom and island fortress of the Greek world to cross the water, to burn the city of Troy to the ground, and to take back a stolen queen. But the sea would not let them leave. Stagnation in a war camp breeds madness. The heat was relentless. The water in the barrels turned foul. Disease began to move quietly through the crowded, stifling tents. Rations turned to ash and dust. The warlords and kings of Greece, men like Odysseus, Ajax, and Diomedes, who had sworn terrifying blood oaths to conquer the world, were now prisoners of the motionless air. Every morning they woke to the same oppressive silence, staring out at a flat, dead horizon they could not reach. The gods had anchored them there, and the gods do not halt an army of that size without demanding a terrible toll. Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae and supreme commander of this suffocating, restless war machine, felt the eyes of 100,000 starving men turning toward his tent. He summoned the seer Calchas to read the silence of heaven. The prophet looked into the omens. He watched the erratic flight of birds. He burned the fat of offerings and read the smoke. When Calchas finally spoke, the truth he delivered was worse than any storm. The goddess of the hunt, Artemis, had killed the winds. She was offended by the arrogance of the Greek kings. She would only release the fleet if Agamemnon paid a price in blood. He could not sacrifice a prize bull. He could not offer a ransom of gold or captured slaves or the spoils of 50 conquered cities. To start the greatest war in the history of the world, the commander was ordered to slaughter his own eldest daughter on a stone altar. But this trap was not built at Aulis. It was forged years earlier, far above the dirt and the starving men, with a single piece of heavy gleaming fruit. Long before the wind died, the gods gathered in the high halls of Olympus to celebrate the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. It was a flawless, radiant feast. And because it was flawless, Eris, the goddess of discord, was deliberately uninvited. She was the bringer of strife. Her mere presence was an insult to the sacred order of the hall. But exclusion is its own kind of invitation. Eris did not storm the golden gates. She did not draw a sword or raise her voice or demand a seat. She simply walked out of the shadows to the threshold of the great hall and rolled a solid golden apple across the stone floor. It chimed heavily against the marble, a beautiful alien sound that immediately drew the eyes of every immortal in the room. Carved into its golden skin were 3 words: for the fairest. Instantly, 3 towering powers claimed the prize: Hera, the queen of heaven; Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom; and Aphrodite, the goddess of desire. The light in the hall turned cold. A choice had to be made, but it was a choice that would instantly create 2 immortal enemies. Zeus, the king of the gods, understood the danger of the apple perfectly. He knew that to choose among his wife and his daughters was to fracture the divine order itself. Olympus would burn if he handed the prize to any of them. He refused the burden. He pushed the choice, and the inevitable catastrophic wrath down onto the mortal world. He selected Paris, a shepherd prince of Troy, to be the judge. When the 3 powers of heaven descended upon the mortal on Mount Ida, they did not ask for his honest judgment. They offered bribes. Hera offered him absolute dominion over the earth, a throne without equal. Athena offered him unmatched military glory, promising he would never lose a battle. But Aphrodite understood the ruinous weakness of men. She did not offer him a throne or a sword. She offered him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Whether from blinding lust or profound foolishness, Paris handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In doing so, he made permanent enemies of the Queen of Heaven and the Goddess of War. More dangerously, he accepted a prize that did not belong to him. Helen was already married to Menelaus, a terrifying Greek king with a heavy sword. When Paris crossed the sea, broke the sacred laws of hospitality, and took Helen from Sparta, he awoke a dormant curse. The abduction did not just break a marriage, It triggered an ancient oath sworn in blood by every king in Greece. Years before, when Helen was of age, her beauty had threatened to tear the continent apart. Every warlord, king, and prince had arrived at her father's court, hands resting on the hilts of their swords, vying for her hand. The tension in the hall was a spark away from a continent-wide civil war. To prevent a bloodbath, her earthly father, Tyndareus, forced every suitor into a binding, terrifying covenant. He sacrificed a horse, hacking it into pieces, and made the rival king stand upon the severed, bleeding flesh. There, ankle-deep in blood, they swore a sacred oath. Whoever won Helen's hand would be defended by all the others. If any man ever tried to steal her, the entirety of Greece would be religiously bound to hunt the thief down and burn his city to the ground. When Paris took Helen, the oath of Tyndareus snapped shut around the throats of the Greeks. The kings did not gather their armies out of a deep brotherly love for Menelaus. Men like Odysseus and Achilles cared nothing for Spartan marital disputes. They gathered because they were bound by the dread of the gods who had witnessed the oath on the severed horse. If they broke the covenant, they would face divine wrath. Timber was stripped from the mountains. Armor was hammered out in the heat of 1,000 forges. The heroes left their homes, pulled by the invisible chains of a blood promise and a divine beauty contest. They marched to the sea, an unstoppable tide of bronze and fury, expecting to launch a glorious campaign. But this trap was not built for glory. They arrived at Aulis to find the water turned to glass and the wind dead. The gods had built the snare perfectly. They had used human vanity to trigger a human law, gathering the greatest mortal force in history into one harbor. And then, they closed the jaws. They turned off the wind. When the seer Calchas told Agamemnon that he must sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, the commander was crushed beneath the weight of his crown. He was a father, but he was also the shepherd of a starving, restless, violent army. The men were sharpening their swords for a war they could not reach. The kings he commanded, cunning men, dangerous men, were watching him closely. They were trapped just as he was, unable to sail forward, forbidden by oath to sail home. The whispers of mutiny grew louder every night. If Agamemnon refused the goddess, the wind would never blow. The army would turn on him. They would tear him apart on the beach, and then march on his home in Mycenae to slaughter his family for failing the oath. He was trapped between the unyielding altar and the hungry mob. Agamemnon broke. He chose the army. But he could not simply order a royal princess to travel to a filthy military camp to be executed. He had to lure her. He placed his heavy royal seal on a letter to his home, ordering his wife Clytemnestra to send Iphigenia to Aulis. In the letter, Agamemnon did not write of Artemis, or dead winds, or blood. He wrote that Achilles, the golden son of Greece, the greatest warrior of the age, demanded to marry the girl before he would sail for Troy. Achilles knew nothing of this letter. His name was simply the bait used to pull a daughter to the slaughterhouse. Back in the high stone walls of Mycenae, Queen Clytemnestra received the seal and wept with fierce motherly pride. Her eldest girl was to marry a demigod. Clytemnestra personally bathed Iphigenia in perfumed oils. She packed heavy chests with fine woven bridal linens and gleaming silver jewelry. She kissed her daughter's forehead, placed her in a royal chariot, and waved her off toward the coast, entirely unaware that she had just prepared her firstborn for the butcher's block. When the chariot carrying Iphigenia finally arrived at the military camp, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and hot metal. There was no wedding music waiting for her. There were no flowers strewn across her path. There was only the suffocating heat, the silent ships, and the grim, hollow faces of tens of thousands of men who needed her to die so they could leave. Iphigenia realized the truth only when she was led not to a wedding canopy, but to a rough stone altar. She saw the priests waiting with hard eyes. She saw the heavy bronze blade gripped tightly in her father's hand. She fell to her knees and begged. She wept, reminding him that she was his firstborn, the first to bring joy to his halls, the first to call him father. She reached for his knees, pleading for the life he had given her. But the collective will of the desperate army and the absolute silence of heaven were vastly heavier than her tears. To maintain order, and to prevent her from laying a dying curse upon the ships, the soldiers seized her. They wrapped a heavy gag around her mouth, silencing her screams. They lifted her struggling body above the stone. Agamemnon, the great king of Mycenae, raised the knife over his own flesh and blood, shut his eyes against her muffled cries, and brought the iron down. The stone drank. The girl died. Almost instantly, the heavy dead air shifted. A cold breeze swept through the harbor. The sails slammed taut against the masts. The sea woke up, crashing against the wooden hulls. Artemis was satisfied. 1,000 ships pushed out into the Aegean, bound for the shores of Troy. They went to fight a war for an oath. But the tragedy was already complete. As they sailed toward the horizon, victorious in their departure, they left a dead girl on a bloody stone behind them. The gods had won. The Greeks were on their way to burn a city, but they had already destroyed themselves to get there. The dogs died first. The lean, scarred hunting hounds that guarded the perimeter of the black ships collapsed in the sand, their ribs heaving, choking on nothing. Then the mules, the heavy beasts of burden, dropped in their traces. Then the men. There was no sound of an approaching army, no battle cry echoing across the plains of Troy. There was only the sudden, suffocating heat, a windless weight settling over the shoreline, and the bodies of Greek soldiers collapsing in the dust of their own camp. For 9 unbroken days, the thick black smoke from the funeral pyres blocked out the sun. The greatest army the ancient world had ever assembled was rotting from the inside out, trapped between the impregnable stone walls of Troy and the dark waters of the sea. They were not dying in honorable combat with bronze in their hands. They were dying in fever, in agony, and in blind, staggering confusion. They did not know who was killing them, but their supreme commander, King Agamemnon, knew exactly why the camp was burning. He had invited the fire himself. Days earlier, an old man had walked into the center of the Greek encampment. He carried no weapons. He carried only a king's ransom in heavy gold, and the woolen bands of a priest wrapped around a golden staff. His name was Chryses, a priest of Apollo, the god of light, archery, and sudden silent death. Chryses had come to buy back his daughter Chryseis, who had been taken in a coastal raid and given to Agamemnon as a prize of war. The priest had done everything the ancient laws demanded. He offered the gold. He showed absolute submission to the Greek kings. He formally requested the return of his blood. The soldiers of the Greek army beat their spears against their shields in a roar of approval. Take the gold. Respect the priest. Fear the god. But Agamemnon refused. Agamemnon's throne rested entirely on his ability to force lesser kings to bow. He was the commander who had dragged his own daughter to an altar and sacrificed her just to secure the winds to sail to Troy. To Agamemnon, surrendering this captive girl meant bowing to an old man in front of 100,000 soldiers. It meant looking weak. So he did not just refuse the ransom. He broke the sacred, unwritten law of the suppliant. He threatened the old man. He told the priest that his daughter would grow old in a foreign bed, working the heavy loom in the king's house in Argos. He ordered Chryses to run while he still had his life. The priest did not argue. He turned his back on the thousands of armed men and walked in silence along the shore of the sounding sea. And when he was far enough from the black hulls of the Greek ships, he raised his hands and prayed to Apollo. He did not ask for his daughter. He asked for the Greeks to pay for his tears. Apollo heard him. The god came down from the peaks of Olympus, dark as night, his silver bow clashing on his shoulders with every step. He did not issue a warning. He did not demand a parley. He simply knelt on the edge of the camp, drew the silver string back, and began to shoot. Invisible arrows of pestilence rained into the Greek ranks. The plague struck the animals first, a silent, creeping slaughter that left the camp paralyzed. Then, it turned to the men. The fever swept through the densely packed tents, brutal and unrelenting. Men who had survived a decade of grinding siege warfare choked on their own blood in the dirt. Now, 9 days later, the army was breaking. Agamemnon sat in his command tent, watching the thick black smoke drift across the beach. He did nothing. He would not admit fault. He would rather watch his soldiers burn to ash than confess to the lesser kings that his arrogance had doomed them. It was Achilles who finally broke the silence. Achilles was not a king of kings. He was the Greeks' deadliest weapon, a force of nature driven entirely by the absolute pursuit of immortal glory. He saw the army bleeding out, and he commanded an assembly of the leaders. The heat in the camp was oppressive as the kings gathered. They came in their heavy bronze cuirasses, the metal baking against their skin, exhausted, terrified, and waiting for an answer. Achilles brought forward Calchas, the army's chief prophet. But Calchas was paralyzed by fear. He knew exactly why the plague was happening, but he also knew the brutal reality of what Agamemnon did to men who crossed him. Calchas trembled before the assembly of kings. He demanded a blood oath. He would only speak if the greatest warrior alive promised to protect him from the wrath of the king. Achilles swore it. Under that absolute protection, the prophet pointed his finger directly at the throne. The plague was not a mystery. It was the direct consequence of Agamemnon's pride. Apollo would not lift the sickness until the girl was returned without ransom, and a sacred offering of cattle was burned on an altar. Agamemnon stood up, his eyes black with rage. He had been trapped before the eyes of his own men. He knew he had to return the girl. An army of corpses cannot lay siege to a city. But the thought of returning his prize while the lesser kings kept theirs was intolerable. To a king like Agamemnon, a ruler's honor was a physical thing. To surrender his prize while his commanders kept theirs was not just an insult. It was a public surrender of his dominance. If he had to give up his prize, he declared, he would take someone else's to restore the weight of his crown. He would take a prize from Ajax, or Odysseus, or Achilles. He chose Achilles. He demanded Briseis, the captive woman who had been awarded to the great warrior. To demand Briseis was to demand the physical weight of Achilles' glory. It was public proof of the blood he had spilled and the respect he commanded on the battlefield. By threatening to take her, Agamemnon was publicly stripping Achilles of his worth. He was declaring to the entire army that the greatest warrior among them was nothing more than a servant, whose honors could be revoked at the king's whim. Achilles' hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. The insult was absolute. The urge to draw the heavy bronze blade and split Agamemnon's chest open in front of the council was overwhelming. It would sever the oaths that bound the army together. It would mean a bloody civil war on the shores of Troy, but it would wipe the insult from the earth. He pulled the blade half out of its scabbard. The metal hissed against the leather. The surrounding kings held their breath, waiting for the slaughter to begin. But a sudden, terrifying force stopped him. The goddess Athena, sent from Olympus, appeared behind him and gripped him by his golden hair. Invisible to the rest of the camp, she ordered him to sheathe the sword. She promised that Agamemnon's arrogance would eventually cost him 3 times over in gifts and glory, if Achilles only stayed his hand. Achilles pushed the blade back into the scabbard. He chose a colder, far more devastating revenge. Achilles looked at Agamemnon and delivered his judgment. He reminded the king that the Trojans had never wronged the men of Phthia. Achilles' fiercest spearmen had not sailed across the sea to avenge their own stolen wives or burned cities. They had come solely to fight for Agamemnon's brother. And in return, Agamemnon was behaving like a coward who sat safely in his tent while better men did the dying, only to steal their rewards when the fighting was done. Achilles took the royal scepter, the heavy wooden staff studded with gold nails that granted a man the sacred right to speak, and threw it into the dirt. He swore a solemn oath. The day was coming, he said, when the Greeks would fall in droves under the sword of the Trojan prince Hector. And when they were dying against the hulls of their own ships, begging for salvation, Agamemnon would tear his own heart out in despair, knowing he had dishonored the best of the Greeks. Achilles turned his back on the king, walked out of the assembly, and returned to his camp. Agamemnon was too blind to see the trap closing around him. Desperate to prove he was not intimidated by a subordinate, he followed through on his threat. He summoned 2 of his royal heralds and ordered them to walk to the tents of the Myrmidons to take Briseis. The heralds walked in absolute terror. The journey down the shoreline felt endless, the sun beating down on their shoulders. the sound of the waves drowning out their footsteps. They knew they were stepping into the territory of a man who could slaughter them before they drew breath. They walked the long stretch of beach, trembling as they finally stood before Achilles' tent. The spearmen watched them in dead silence. But Achilles did not draw his sword against them. He understood the ruthless laws of power far better than Agamemnon did. He brought Briseis out from his tent and handed her over. He told the heralds they were blameless. They were merely tools. The crime and the ruin that would follow belonged entirely to the king. As they led her away, the theft was complete. Agamemnon had preserved his crown. He had forced the greatest warrior in the world to submit to his law and surrender his prize. But it was a hollow, catastrophic victory. Achilles was no longer fighting. He returned to his tent and ordered his men to stand down. He pulled his black ships back along the shoreline, away from the killing fields. He formally withdrew his spears, his armor, and his blood from the Greek cause. He would sit by the sea and watch them burn. The plague of Apollo eventually lifted once Chryseis was placed on a ship and returned to her father. The pyres stopped burning, and the thick smoke cleared from the sky. But a new, deeper sickness settled over the Greek camp. It was dread. The news spread from tent to tent, from fire to fire. The Myrmidons were out of the war. Without Achilles, the Greeks had lost their vanguard. They had lost the nightmare that kept the Trojans hiding behind their massive stone walls. For 10 agonizing years, Hector and the Trojan army had refused to fight on the open plain because Achilles was there. The mere sight of his armor flashing in the sun was enough to break a charge. Now, the plains were empty. Agamemnon thought he was proving his absolute, unbreakable control over the army. Instead, he had exposed its fatal weakness. To save himself from the public embarrassment of a minor concession to a priest, he had shattered the only blade capable of taking the city and handed the Trojans the greatest victory of the war without them lifting a single spear. The king had secured his pride, but the Greeks would pay for it in blood. Menelaus of Sparta was not using a sword. He was using his bare hands. He was twisting a heavy, horsehair-crested helmet, hauling Paris backward through the dirt toward the Greek lines. The thick leather chin strap was digging deep into Paris's throat, cutting off his air, choking the life out of him. Paris was thrashing wildly. His heels dragged deep trenches in the dry dust. He was seconds away from death. And the thousands of men watching from the limestone walls of Troy, and the thousands of Greeks leaning heavily on their ash spears, did not make a single sound. After 10 years of bronze striking bronze, of ships rotting in the salt wind, of pyres burning through the night and disease stripping the camps, they were watching the war end. The plague of it, the hunger of it. It was going to be finished cleanly, right here in the dirt between the armies. But the killing did not stop. The war would rage on to consume them all. The men on the plain believed they could chain a decade of madness with a single oath. But human oaths mean nothing when the gods desire blood. The cruelty of Olympus was not just in stealing a victory. It was in destroying the highest law of the ancient world. Hours before Menelaus wrapped his hands around that helmet, the killing had stalled. There was no glory left on the plain, only the slow, undeniable certainty of death. The armor was heavy with rust and dried blood. The men were hollowed out by grief and dysentery. They were no longer fighting for honor. They were fighting because they had forgotten how to stop. Into that heavy stillness stepped Paris. He wore the skin of a leopard draped over his shoulders, flashing a curved bow and twin spears. He stood in the open space between the armies, offering a challenge to the Greek lines. A single combat. Winner takes Helen. Winner takes the stolen wealth of Sparta. The loser dies in the dirt, and the remaining men pack their rotting ships and sail home. The armies did not just agree, they wept with relief. A great collective exhale swept across the plains. Men stripped off their heavy bronze armor and dropped their shields to the earth. They ceased to be soldiers. They became witnesses to a sacred covenant. They brought out unblemished lambs. They carried mixing bowls of dark, heavy wine. Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, and the elders of Troy stood before the watching camps. Agamemnon drew a ritual knife and cut the wool from the heads of the lambs, distributing it to the leaders of both sides. Then, he raised his hands to the sky and swore the oath aloud. He drew the blade across the throats of the lambs. They bled out into the dry earth. The men poured the unmixed wine upon the ground, and as the dark liquid soaked into the dust, the armies spoke the curse as one voice: Zeus, and all you immortal gods. Whoever breaks this truce first, let his brains, and the brains of his children, be poured out upon the ground, just as this wine is poured. The Trojans swore it. The Greeks swore it. The oath was sealed in blood, wine, and stone. They had bound the chaos of a 10-year slaughter into a single, unbreakable contract. The war was no longer in the hands of fate. It was in the hands of two men. The space was cleared. The lots were drawn. The duel began. It was not a contest. It was an execution. Paris threw his spear first, but the heavy bronze point struck the massive layered shield of Menelaus and bent uselessly, like soft lead against a stone wall. Menelaus prayed aloud to Zeus for rightful vengeance. He stepped into his throw and hurled his own spear with terrifying force. It punched straight through Paris's shield, ripping through his heavy armor and tearing the linen tunic across his ribs. Paris twisted away just in time to save his flesh, but Menelaus was already moving. He drew his silver-studded sword, raised it high, and brought it down on the crest of Paris's helmet with all the weight of his 10 years of fury. With a sharp crack, the sword shattered into 4 pieces. Menelaus screamed at the sky, cursing Zeus for his cruelty, but his rage propelled him forward. He lunged with his bare hands, grabbed the thick horsehair crest of Paris's helmet, and threw the Trojan prince to the ground. That was the moment the armies watched, holding their breath, the thick strap choking Paris, the end of the war dragging through the dust. Justice finally. Seconds away. Then, the strap snapped. It did not break from the force of the pull. The leather was newly cut from a slaughtered ox. It was unbreakable by mortal hands. It snapped because Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was standing invisible in the dust. She refused to watch her chosen mortal die. Menelaus stumbled backward, the sudden release of tension throwing him off balance. He looked down at his hands. He was holding an empty bronze shell. He turned in a blind rage, hurling the empty helmet into the Greek lines. He tore a bronze spear from the dirt and charged back to the spot to finish the kill. But Paris was gone. Where the prince had been lying, choking on his own blood, there was only a thick, unnatural mist. Aphrodite had wrapped him in a cloud and swept him off the battlefield entirely. She carried him over the walls, dropping him safely inside his own perfumed bedroom in the heart of Troy. Down on the plain, Menelaus stalked through the Trojan ranks like a starving beast. He was hunting for the man he was rightfully owed, and the Trojans did not try to hide Paris. They did not raise their spears against the Spartan king. The myth tells us clearly, the Trojans hated Paris like Black Death. If they had seen him, they would have handed him over to be slaughtered. Agamemnon's voice rang out across the quiet battlefield, echoing off the high walls of Troy. The victory belongs to Menelaus. Hand over the woman. Hand over the wealth. By the oaths they had sworn, he was entirely right. Paris had fled the field. The duel was forfeit. But high above the dirt, on the peaks of Mount Olympus, the gods were holding a council. Zeus looked down at the paused war. He suggested to the assembly that perhaps they should let the oath stand. Let Troy survive. Let Menelaus take his wife and go home. Hera, the queen of heaven, raged at the thought. She hated Troy with a violence that could not be measured or reasoned with. She did not want his surrender. She wanted the high walls thrown down. She wanted the city burned to ash. She wanted the blood of every Trojan poured into the sea. Zeus yielded to her wrath. He sent Athena down to the battlefield with a single cold command. Make the Trojans break the oath. Make them commit an act so vile so entirely unforgivable that no man or god could ever defend their walls again. Down on the plain, thousands of men stood perfectly still. The heat was suffocating. The peace was fragile, held together by nothing but the spilled blood of the lambs and the terror of the gods. Athena took the form of a Trojan spearman. She moved silently through the tense ranks until she found a master archer named Patroclus. He was a man deeply proud of his bow, a beautiful weapon crafted from the polished horns of a wild ibex. Athena whispered into his ear. She poured poison into his mind, promising him eternal glory and heavy gold from Paris if he simply raised his bow and struck down the Spartan king right now, while his guard was down. Blinded by the sudden promise of fame, Patroclus listened. He unstrung his bow. He selected a feathered arrow that had never been fired. He crouched low, hiding behind the heavy ox-hide shields of his own men so the Greeks across the plain would not see him drawing the string back. He pulled the string to his chest. The heavy iron arrowhead rested perfectly on the bone of the bow. He released it. The arrow screamed across the open space. It bypassed the heavy shields. It bypassed the sacred peace. It struck Menelaus perfectly where the golden clasps of his belt met his armored chestplate. It drove through the bronze. It drove through the linen tunic. It bit deep into his flesh. Dark blood flowed down the king's thighs, pooling at his ankles in the dirt. When Agamemnon saw his brother bleeding, the world collapsed. He took Menelaus's hand, and he began to weep. The Greeks standing around them shuddered. The stillness of the plain finally broke. Agamemnon knew exactly what the blood meant, and he spoke the terrible truth aloud. The Trojans have trampled the oaths. They have made the sacrifices a joke. He knew that because the oath was broken, Troy was marked for absolute ruin. The gods would have to punish the perjury. The brains of the Trojans would be poured out upon the ground, just as the wine was poured. But he also knew the immediate, terrible cost. The clean end they had prayed for was dead. There would be no surrender now. There would be no negotiations. The oaths of men had been erased. The Trojan ranks began to move. The shields locked together into a wall of bronze. The spears came down. The fragile peace was shattered by a single arrow. The war roared back to life, uglier and more merciless than before. Oaths meant nothing when Olympus desired blood. The armies crashed together, returning to the slow, brutal work of slaughter. And out by the rotting ships, sitting entirely alone in his tent, Achilles was still refusing to fight. The Greeks were now trapped in a cursed, lawless war, and their greatest weapon was watching them bleed. If you want to see what finally drags Achilles out of his tent, and how the gods continue to punish the men of the plain, subscribe and stay with Mythkipedia. The destruction of Troy is just beginning. The wood begins to blacken. It starts with the smell of pitch and dry pine catching fire. For 10 years, the Greek ships have sat on the shoreline, a massive wooden wall kilometers long, rotting slowly in the salt air. They are not just transport. They are the only way home. And now, they are burning. Hector of Troy has done the impossible. He has smashed through the deep defensive trench. He has shattered the outer wall of stone and sharpened stakes. He has driven the greatest army in the world backward, pinning tens of thousands of men against the crushing waves of the sea. There is no retreat. If the fleet burns, the Greeks do not lose a war. They die. Every single one of them. It will be a total slaughter on foreign soil, their bones left for the scavenging birds. And watching this collapse from a distance, standing by his own untouched hulls, is Achilles. He does not move. The sand beneath his feet is cold. He listens to the screams of men being pushed into the surf. He watches the thick, oily smoke climb into the sky, blotting out the sun. He has sworn an oath to withhold his blade, a punishment for the disrespect of his king. His pride is absolute. He will watch the army burn to ash before he breaks his own word. But how does a desperate lie meant to save tens of thousands of lives become the most devastating mistake of the ancient world? It begins with the man standing in his shadow. Patroclus. Patroclus is not bound by the same cold pride. He looks at the smoke rising from the shoreline. He hears the breaking of timber and the dying gasps of men he has fought beside for a decade. The tension snaps. Patroclus turns to Achilles, weeping, and makes a demand that will alter the course of myth. If Achilles will not fight, he must lend his armor. Let Patroclus put on the great bronze plates. Let him drive the chariot into the ash. The Trojans are exhausted. If they see the armor of Achilles, if they see the silhouette of the god of war returning to the field, the sheer terror of that image will break their lines. They will flee, and the ships will be pulled from the fire. Achilles looks at the slaughter, and he agrees. But he establishes a law, a strict, immovable boundary. He tells Patroclus, "Drive them from the ships, put out the fire. And the moment the ships are safe, you turn back. Do not pursue them. Do not try to take the city. Do not steal my glory. You go only as far as the fire." Patroclus swears it. He strips off his own gear. He straps on the heavy bronze greaves of Achilles. He pulls the massive breastplate over his chest, feeling the immense crushing weight of it settle against his collarbones. The bronze is cold, forged by a god, and it carries the memory of 100 slaughtered men. He places the plumed helmet on his head, the heavy metal dropping to conceal his face, leaving only a narrow slit for his eyes. There is only one thing he does not take: the great ashen spear of Achilles. It is too heavy. No mortal man can lift it. He climbs into the chariot. The immortal horses are whipped forward. Down at the shoreline, the Greeks are breaking. Hector has his hand on the stern of a ship, calling for torches. The ash is falling like snow over the dead. And then, a sound rises above the dying. The thunder of hooves, the crack of the whip, and the blinding reflection of polished bronze tearing through the smoke. The Trojans look up. They see the armor. They see the towering crest of the helmet cutting through the haze. They do not see a man. They see the wrath of Achilles made physical. A shockwave of pure, paralyzing dread hits the Trojan line. Men drop their torches. Formations shatter. The Trojans trample each other in their desperate panic to get away from the chariot. The terror of the bronze strikes deeper than any spear. Patroclus strikes. He is a lethal warrior in his own right, his own spear finding throat and bone, and now he is fighting men who are already beaten by fear. He drives them back from the water. He cuts down Trojan commanders, leaving their bodies to be crushed beneath the heavy wooden wheels of his chariot. Blood turns the sand into dark, wet mud. The fire on the hulls is stamped out under the boots of fleeing men. The fleet is safe. The fire is dead. The Trojans are routed. This is the moment Patroclus is supposed to turn back. This is the boundary Achilles drew. But something happens to Patroclus inside the bronze. The armor changes him. The rhythm of the slaughter, the sight of an entire army fleeing before him, the intoxicating taste of absolute ruin. It acts as a venom in his blood. The fear he inspires feels too much like divinity. He sits in the chariot, looking at the retreating backs of the Trojan army. He hears the voice of Achilles in his mind. You go only as far as the fire. But the fire is behind him, and the glory is ahead. He ignores the voice. He does not pull the reins. He does not turn the chariot around. He drives straight past the ashes of the ships. He crosses the blood-soaked plain. He chases the fleeing army. He has turned salvation into a march toward his own ruin. To reach the towering walls of Troy, Patroclus must cross the open plain. The chariot wheels kick up clouds of choking dust, turning the sky a violent red. He cuts his way through the Trojan rearguard, his spear shattering shields and splitting breastplates. He is no longer just wearing the armor, he is possessed by its hunger. Then the chariot path is blocked by a king, Sarpedon of Lycia. Sarpedon is the greatest of Troy's allies. More importantly, he is the mortal son of Zeus. From the peak of Mount Olympus, the king of the gods watches his son step into the path of the false Achilles. Zeus considers breaking the laws of fate to snatch his son from the dirt, but he is warned. If he saves his son, every god will want to save theirs. The world will unravel. Zeus must watch him die. The false Achilles does not hesitate. The two chariots clash. Sarpedon throws his spear, missing Patroclus, but striking his trace horse. The animal screams, tangling the lines in a mess of blood and leather. Patroclus does not flinch. He steps forward, plants his boots in the blood-slicked dirt, and throws. The bronze tip drives straight through Sarpedon's chest, piercing the heart. The giant king falls like a felled oak. As Sarpedon bleeds out into the dust, Zeus himself weeps tears of blood from the heavens, letting them fall on the plain of Troy. Patroclus stands over the corpse of a god's son. He pulls his spear from the chest, setting his boot on the dead king. This is the height of his power, and it is the seal of his doom. He has killed the blood of Olympus. He is no longer fighting a mortal war. He has invited the anger of the sky. Blinded by the slaughter, Patroclus pushes all the way to the massive gates of the city. He attempts to scale the sheer stone wall itself, driven by a madness that belongs to the armor, not to the man. 3 times he tries to breach Troy. 3 times he is pushed back by a force greater than himself. The myth tells us it is Apollo, the god of archery and plague, who steps into the dust. The divine order of the world will not allow Troy to fall today, and it will certainly not allow it to fall to a man wearing a disguise. In the chaos of the fighting, the god moves unseen behind him. A heavy, flat blow strikes Patroclus between the shoulders. It is not a fatal strike, but it is absolute in its judgment. The blow knocks the helmet from his head. It rolls into the dirt under the trampling hooves of horses. The great breastplate cracks and falls away. The spear in his hand splinters into dead wood. Suddenly, the illusion is stripped away. The cold wind hits his sweat-drenched skin. He is suddenly small, exposed flesh, a mortal stripped of his godhood. The sheer physical exhaustion of the slaughter hits him all at once. His knees buckle. His vision blurs. The air leaves his lungs. The Trojans stop fleeing. They look back. They see a man staggering in the dust, stripped of his bronze, stripped of his terror. They realize they have been running from a ghost. A Trojan soldier steps forward and drives a spear into Patroclus's back. He falls into the dirt, and then Hector arrives. Hector, who had been pushed back to his own gates, stands over the broken, gasping man. He drives his spear through Patroclus's stomach, the killing blow. As Patroclus bleeds out into the dirt of Troy, the terrible gravity of what has happened settles over the battlefield. Hector strips the armor from the corpse. He takes the bronze that belongs to Achilles and fastens it to his own body. But the physical loss of the metal is nothing. Back at the Greek camp, the ships are safe. The fire is out. The army will survive. Achilles had his cold victory. He kept his oath. He did not bleed. He shielded his men behind a borrowed shadow. But he is about to receive a messenger running from the gates of Troy, his face covered in ash, carrying news that will shatter Achilles more completely than any blade ever could. Achilles tried to fight a war without stepping into the dirt. He sent his image, his shadow, into the fire. He saved the ships, but he sent his own soul out to die in borrowed bronze. And when he realizes what his absolute pride has cost, the wrath that follows will burn brighter than any ship ever could. The story of how that broken man brought a city to its knees begins exactly where this one ends. He took a bronze dagger, knelt in the dust of the Trojan plain, and punched holes through the tendons of the dead prince's ankles. He threaded thick oxhide straps through the gaping wounds, tied them to the back of his chariot, and whipped his horses into a sprint. The dead man's head, once the pride of a civilization, the face of Troy's defense, slammed into the dirt. As the horses plunged forward, the body bounced and twisted, dragged backward through the sharp stones. From the walls of the city, parents watched their son become meat. There is a boundary in the ancient world. A man may be broken. His life, his armor, and his city may be taken. But when the breath leaves him, the flesh belongs to the earth. The greatest warrior of the Greeks knew this law, and he chose to break it. This was not a victory. This was an attempt to erase a man from the earth entirely. This atrocity was not born of strategy. It was born of a void. The warrior had lost his closest companion, struck down by the Prince of Troy. When the news reached the Greek camp, the grief did not arrive as tears. It arrived as a force of absolute ruin. The blood demanded an answer. He re-entered the war not as a soldier, but as a plague. He slaughtered so many men that the local river choked on the dead. The water ran thick and red, and the river god himself rose up in a towering wave to drown the Greek, disgusted by the mass of corpses defiling his currents. But nothing stopped the advance. He pushed through blood and water until he reached the high stone gates of Troy. And there stood the prince. The prince knew he was going to die. He had seen the slaughter. When the Greek charged, shining like a star of ill omen, the prince's nerve failed. He ran. 3 times the Greek chased the air of Troy around the massive walls of the city. Finally, the prince stopped. He drew his sword. He made a desperate, final charge. The Greek knew his own armor, the armor the prince had stripped from the dead companion. He knew exactly where the gaps were. With the cold precision of a butcher, he drove his heavy spear straight through the prince's neck. As the Trojan choked on his own blood, he made one final plea. He did not ask for his life. He asked for the oldest law of men, the final right of the dead. "I beg," he gasped. "Do not let the dogs devour me. Take the gold my father will offer. Give my body back to my people, so they may grant me the honor of fire." The Greek stood over the dying man. His eyes were empty. "Do not beg, dog," he said. "If the rage allowed, I would carve your flesh and eat it raw. No one will keep the dogs from your head. Not if they brought 10 times the ransom. Not even if the king weighed your ransom in gold." With a dying breath, the prince cast a curse. He warned that the gods would remember this day, and that an arrow would find the Greek at the city gates. Then the soul left the prince and descended to the dark. The duel was over, but the true horror was only just beginning. The Greeks stripped the armor. The soldiers gathered around, taking turns stabbing the corpse. And then, the bronze dagger came out. The ankles were pierced. The knot was tied. The dragging began. If the cruelty had ended there, it might have been excused as the frenzy of war. But it did not end. The next morning, the Greek woke up. The emptiness had not been filled by the killing. So he went back to the corpse. He hitched the body to the chariot again. 3 times he dragged the prince around the burial mound of his fallen companion. Dust rising, bone grinding against rock. Then he left the body in the dirt, face down. He did this the next day, and the next. For 12 days, the greatest warrior in the world reduced himself to a butcher, mutilating a corpse in a desperate, futile attempt to carve his own pain into someone else's flesh. The act was so vile that the gods could no longer look away. Apollo, moving unseen, wrapped the corpse in a golden aegis. He protected the skin from tearing. Every morning, the Greek tried to destroy the body. Every night, the gods restored it. It was a silent, terrifying stalemate, a mortal fighting against the order of the universe. The king of Troy was an old man, broken by the loss of his sons, watching the daily ruin of his bloodline from the city walls. Guided by the gods under the cover of absolute darkness, the king loaded a wagon with treasure. He crossed the blood-soaked plain. He bypassed the sentries. He entered the enemy camp. Inside the tent, the Greek sat in silence. He had won, and he had nothing. The tent flap opened. Before the Greek could react, the king dropped to the floor. The ruler of Troy crawled across the rugs. He reached out, took the hands of the Greek, and kissed them. He kissed the terrifying, man-slaughtering hands that had killed so many of his sons. The tent was completely silent. A king does not kneel. A father does not kiss the hands of his son's murderer. The king looked up at the man who had dragged his boy through the dirt. "Revere the gods," the old man whispered. "Have pity, remembering the father far away. No mortal on earth has ever endured this." Lips brought to the hands of the man who killed the child. It was a devastating blow, stronger than any spear. The Greek looked at the old man. He saw his own father, far away, who would soon receive the news that his son was dead. He looked at the blood on his own hands. The wrath that had sustained him for 12 days suddenly collapsed. He began to weep. The killer and the king wept together in the dark. The Greek pushed the old man gently away, overpowered by the weight of mortal sorrow. The rage broke, leaving only exhaustion. He ordered the women to wash and anoint the body. He lifted the prince onto a bier with his own hands, shielding the father from the true extent of the ruin. He swore an oath, binding himself to 12 days of stillness so the city could burn their dead. The king returned to Troy in the dark, bearing the weight of his dead son. The city wept. They built a great pyre. They burned the prince, gathered his white bones into a golden box, and heaped a high mound of earth over the defender of Troy. The body had been returned, but the cosmic scales had tipped too far. A mortal does not punch holes in the ankles of a prince, does not drag the dead for 12 days, and does not defy the gods without paying the toll. The Greek had sealed the doom of Troy, yes, but in the dust of the Trojan plain, he had also sealed his own. His death was now required. The arrow was already waiting. This is Mythkipedia. We do not soften the old stories. If you want the myths as they were meant to be told, grave, brutal, and true, subscribe now. The next reckoning is coming. The greatest killer in the ancient world died face down in the mud. It did not happen in single combat. It did not happen crossing swords with a worthy king. Achilles, the undisputed terror of the Trojan War, was brought down by an arrow fired from a distance, by a prince who preferred the safety of a bow to the risk of a blade. Guided by the hand of the god Apollo, the shaft found the only vulnerable flesh on Achilles' body, his heel. The poison of the bronze tip worked quickly. The man who had slaughtered armies, who had dragged the corpse of Hector behind his chariot, simply collapsed. His death sent a wave of cold panic through the Greek lines. Achilles was not just a soldier, he was their ultimate weapon. Without him, the walls of Troy seemed suddenly, impossibly high. But before they could mourn, there was the matter of his body and his armor. It was not normal bronze. The armor of Achilles had been forged by Hephaestus, the god of fire. It was a masterpiece of divine metal, the ultimate mark of a king. The Trojans rushed forward to hack it from his corpse. The Greeks fought desperately to drag him back. In the chaos, two men held the line. Ajax the Great, a man built like a fortress, heaved the massive, blood-slicked body of Achilles onto his shoulders and carried him toward the ships. Beside him, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, fought a bloody retreat, holding the Trojan spears at bay. They made it to the camp, but saving the body was only the beginning of the tragedy. The body was washed, the funeral pyre was lit, and then the armor was piled in the center of the command tent. The firelight caught the divine gold. It was no longer just protection, it was a crown. Whoever wore the armor of Achilles would be acknowledged as the greatest surviving warrior in Greece. There were only two men who had a claim, the two who had saved the body. To Ajax, the law was blood and iron. He was the tallest, he was the strongest. For 10 years, he had been the unbreakable wall of the Greek army. When the Trojans breached the camp and tried to burn the ships, it was Ajax who fought them off with a ship pole, jumping from deck to deck, killing until his arms went numb. He did not scheme, he did not retreat. He simply bled for Greece. To Ajax, merit was measured in scars. But the Greek commanders, Agamemnon and Menelaus, decided to hold a council. They would vote on who deserved the prize. They sat in a circle. Ajax stood before them. He did not offer a speech. His body was his argument. He pointed to the ships he had saved. He pointed to the battlefield. He glared at Odysseus in heavy, suffocating silence. Let the blades decide, his presence demanded. Throw the armor into the enemy lines and see who is brave enough to bring it back. He sat down, confident. The truth was obvious. Then the liar stood up. Odysseus understood something that Ajax did not. They were in the 10th year of a siege. Pure strength had failed to break the walls of Troy. Achilles was dead. Brute force was no longer enough. The kings were tired, frightened, and desperate for a way out. They did not need another hammer. They needed a knife in the dark. While Ajax sat in silence, Odysseus filled the tent with noise. He did not speak of pure combat. He weaponized his tongue. With soft, lethal precision, he stripped Ajax of his glory. He painted the giant not as a hero, but as a beast of burden. A dumb, blunt instrument useful only when directed by a sharper mind. Odysseus claimed that intellect commanded the spear, and therefore the man of intellect was the master of the man of blood. Every word was a blade slipped between the ribs of Ajax's honor. It was a public butchery, executed entirely through rhetoric. The kings listened. They were swayed by the silver tongue. When the stones were cast into the helmets to count the votes, the verdict was clear. The armor of the gods was handed to Odysseus. Ajax did not scream. He did not draw his blade in the council tent. He walked out into the dark. But inside his chest, something fundamental shattered. It was not just the loss of the gold. It was the breaking of the only law he knew. He had stood in the vanguard, and he had been cast aside for a liar. The kings he had protected had disgraced him in front of the entire army. That night, grief hardened into a cold, unholy fury. He took up his massive sword. He would not wait for morning. He would go to the tents of Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Odysseus. He would butcher them in their sleep. He would wash away the disrespect with the blood of his own commanders. He stepped out into the blackness, his mind fixed on murder. But the gods guard their favorites. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the patron of Odysseus, saw the giant moving through the dark. She knew he was unstoppable. She could not match his brute strength, so she struck his mind. She descended and pressed a hand of cold, heavy dread over Ajax's eyes. This was no mortal sickness. It was a divine curse. She twisted his perception, warping the camp around him. As he approached what he thought were the command tents, he was actually walking into the pens where the Greeks kept the captured livestock, the cattle and sheep meant for the army's rations. In his god-blinded state, Ajax saw the animals as men. He saw a massive ram and thought it was Agamemnon. He saw a bull and thought it was Menelaus. With a roar of vengeance, the greatest warrior of Greece fell upon the herd. He hacked through flesh and bone. He cleaved the heads off sheep, his sword rising and falling in the mud, screaming the names of the kings as he slaughtered defenseless animals. Blood sprayed across his chest. He captured a large ram, tied it up, and dragged it back to his tent. In the dim light of his own shelter, believing the beast was Odysseus, he beat it with a leather strap, laughing at his triumph over the man who had stolen his honor. He had his revenge. He stood in his tent, breathing heavily, soaked in gore, satisfied. Then Athena lifted the veil. The divine fog evaporated. The shadows settled. The ringing in his ears stopped. The copper stench of animal blood and wet wool filled his lungs. Ajax blinked. He looked down at his hands. He looked at the floor of his tent. There was no dead king. There was only a mutilated sheep. He stepped outside into the dawn light. The Greek camp was waking up. Soldiers were gathering near the pens, staring in absolute horror at the carnage. Hundreds of animals, hacked to pieces. And standing in the middle of it, covered in animal filth and gore, was Ajax. The realization was physical, a sickness in his stomach that crushed him like a falling mountain. He had not avenged his honor. He had become a joke. The man who had terrified the armies of Asia had spent the night warring with cattle. The shame was absolute, suffocating, and permanent. The kings would not fear him now. They would pity him, or they would laugh. He fell to his knees in the blood-soaked mud. He wailed. It was a sound that made the soldiers who heard it look away. Ajax knew the rules of the ancient world. A man could survive a lost battle. A man could survive a grievous wound. But a man of honor could not survive absolute ridicule. There was no path forward. His name was ruined forever. He took his sword, a blade given to him long ago by Hector as a gesture of respect between enemies. He walked away from the camp, down to the desolate edge of the beach. He dug a hole in the wet sand. He buried the hilt of the sword deep, packing the earth around it so the blade stood straight up, the sharp edge pointing toward the sky. He did not pray for forgiveness. He prayed to the Furies for vengeance upon the Greek commanders. Then, the strongest man in the world threw himself forward. The iron drove upward through his chest, piercing his heart, ending his life in a single brutal motion. The blood of Ajax soaked into the sand of Troy. With his death, the era of the heroes ended. Achilles was dead. Ajax was dead. The men of pure strength, the men who fought in the open light of day, were gone. The Greek army was left in the hands of the speakers, the schemers, the men of shadows. The physical war was over. The armor of Achilles now belonged to Odysseus, and it would not be a spear or a shield that finally broke the walls of Troy. It would be a hollow wooden horse built on a lie. If you want to hear the dark, unspoken truths behind the old legends, subscribe to Mythkipedia. The old gods are still watching. The beach did not smell of salt anymore. It smelled of dead wood and old ash. For 10 years, the sand at Troy had been a throat that swallowed the blood of two worlds. But on this morning, the throat was silent. The Greek tents were blackened circles in the dirt. The ships, the 1,000 hulls that had choked the horizon, were gone. There was only the wind and the thing the Greeks had left behind. It stood before the Scaean gate like a mountain made of pine in judgment. A horse. Its eyes were cold amber, staring at the walls it could never climb. The Trojans came out of their gates like ghosts. They touched the charred wood of the Greek camps. They were a people who had forgotten the shape of the horizon. They looked at the horse and saw a miracle. They saw an end to the hunger. They saw a sign that the gods had finally grown tired of the slaughter. But the horse was not a gift. It was a trap. Inside that hollow belly, 30 men were crouched in the dark. They breathed each other's sweat. They held their swords so tightly the bronze grew hot against their palms. They were not waiting for peace. They were waiting for the sun to go down so they could turn a city into a slaughterhouse. Odysseus sat in the center of the dark. He was the one who had traded the sword for the lie. He knew that Troy would never fall to iron. It would only fall to its own hope. He had gambled the lives of every hero in Greece on a single truth, that an exhausted man will welcome his own killer if the killer promises him rest. Outside, a priest named Laocoon screamed a warning. He did not trust the silence. He took a heavy spear and hurled it at the horse's ribs. Inside the wood, the Greeks felt the world shake. The spear point bit deep. The wood groaned. For a heartbeat, the armor of the hidden kings clattered, a sharp bronze sound that should have been the hammer strike of their doom. Odysseus reached out in the dark and gripped the throat of a soldier who was about to cry out. He held it until the man's pulse thrashed against his thumb. But the gods had already chosen the side of the deceiver. Two serpents, thick as ship's cables, rose from the salt water. They did not go for the soldiers. They went for the priest and his sons. They crushed the breath out of them until their ribs snapped like dry twigs. To the Trojans, this was not a murder. It was a judgment. They believed the horse was sacred and that the priest had been silenced by the heavens. They threw ropes around the horse's neck. They tore down their own walls, the stones built by Poseidon, to drag their own ruin into the square. Troy did not fall to a blade. It fell to a cup of wine. That night, the city was drunk on the lie of peace. There were no sentries on the battlements. There were no blades in the hands of the young men. There was only the thick, suffocating sleep of those who believe the nightmare has ended. In the center of the square, the horse stood in the moonlight. A bolt slid back. It sounded like a bone breaking. A rope dropped from the belly. Odysseus was the first to touch the ground. He did not look like a king. He looked like a thief. One by one, the elite of Greece spilled onto the stones. They moved through the streets like a fever. They did not shout. They did not call for glory. They went to the houses of the men they had known for a decade, men they had spoken to during truces, and they killed them before they could open their eyes. They opened the gates. The rest of the army, hiding behind the cliffs of Tenedos, poured into the city. The tragedy of Troy is not that it was conquered. It is that the Trojans died while they were dreaming of a dawn they would never see. The fire did not start in the houses. It started in the souls of the men who had become butchers. The Greeks had lived in the dirt for 10 years. They had watched their brothers rot. Their rage was no longer a tool of war. It was a madness. They did not just want to win, they wanted to erase. Old King Priam fled to the altar of Zeus. In the ancient world, the altar was the end of the law. No blood could be spilled there. It was the one place where even a killer found sanctuary. But Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, had no room for the gods. He found the old man clutching the sacred stone. He did not hesitate. He dragged the king through the blood of his own murdered sons and hacked his head from his shoulders on the very spot where the gods were supposed to protect him. The sanctuary was broken. The Greeks had just knotted the noose around their own necks. The heavens were no longer watching a war. They were witnessing a crime. In the temple of Athena, the prophetess Cassandra clung to the feet of the goddess's statue. A Greek named Ajax dragged her away with such force that the stone image toppled into the dirt. In that moment, the air in Troy grew cold. The Trojans were dead, but the Greeks had become the prey. The last act was not a battle. It was a harvest of the innocent. On the high walls of the city, the Greeks gathered what was left. They found the infant Astyanax, the son of Hector. He was a child who had never seen a war, who knew nothing of oaths or kings. But the Greeks looked at him and felt a cold, gray fear. They did not see a baby. They saw a seed that would grow into a revenge they could not survive. They did not use a blade. They took the child by the feet and threw him from the battlements. As the small body hit the stones, the blood of Hector was wiped from the earth. Troy was no longer a city of stone. It was a mountain of bone and fire. The Greeks filled their ships with gold and weeping women. They felt the weight of the loot in their hands. They thought they were rich. But as they pushed their oars into the water, the wind did not feel like a friend. It felt like a trap. Athena, who had spent 10 years guiding the Greeks, turned her back on them. She went to Poseidon, the lord of the deep. She did not ask him to save Troy. She asked him to make the sea a graveyard for the winners. "Give them a homecoming," she said. "That is not a homecoming." The Greeks looked back at the red wound on the coast. They thought the war was over. They thought they had cheated the fates with a wooden horse and a clever lie. They were wrong. The debt for the broken altars was about to be collected. The storms were already gathering in the dark of the Aegean. Some would be smashed against the rocks before they reached the first island. Some would return home only to find their wives waiting in the dark with axes. Others, like Odysseus, would spend another 10 years wandering the wasteland of the waves, watching every man they had ever led disappear into the mouth of the sea. The Trojan Horse had opened the gates of the city, but it had also opened a door to a darkness the Greeks could never close. They had won the war, but in the blood of that night, they had made themselves into something the world would no longer tolerate. Troy was ash, but the Greeks were now the ghosts. The sea is cold, and the gods have long memories. Follow the wreckage into the deep to see how the winners finally paid their debt.